6 sharp pops, a sound like a string of cheap firecrackers, brittle and cruelly dismissive in the afternoon air. The entire event, from the first crack to the last, consumed less than 6 seconds. In that impossibly small sliver of time, a universe of chaos was born. 4 men lay wounded on a Washington sidewalk, their bodies twisted in pain and surprise. A president was bleeding from a lung he didn't yet know was punctured, gasping for air he thought was plentiful. And in the hallowed halls of power, no one could be certain if the United States government itself would survive the day. It was March 30th, 1981, a day that began with the comfortable routine of presidential politics and ended in a frantic, terrifying blur of blood, sirens, and flashing lights. That's the story you think you know, the endlessly replayed grainy footage, the cacophony of shouting reporters. But it's not the whole story. It's not even close. Not until you hear it from the agents, the officers, and the doctors who lived it, the ones who had to make life or death choices and rewrite history between the frantic beats of a dying man's heart. The morning of March 30th felt almost studiously boring, layered in the thousands of mundane yet essential rituals that surround the American presidency. Ronald Reagan, just 69 days into his first term, was still settling into the role. He had spent the early afternoon addressing the AFL-CIO's Building Trades Conference at the Washington Hilton Hotel. He was in his element, a natural performer needling the powerful union bosses with the practiced, disarming charm of a man who had spent decades in front of an audience. He grinned like he'd just won a comfortable bar bet, and the crowd, even those who politically opposed him, couldn't help but be won over. Cameras clicked, the crowd applauded and waved, and at precisely 2:25 p.m., he stepped out of the hotel's protected VIP exit into the crisp, late March air. He raised a hand and waved once more, a perfect picture of American confidence, and began the short, seemingly safe 15-foot walk to the waiting presidential limo, codenamed Stagecoach. But tucked inside the press gaggle, a vulnerable space the Secret Service had negligently failed to secure, stood a nondescript 25-year-old in a tan raincoat zipped all the way to his chin. This was John Hinckley Jr., a profoundly troubled drifter from a wealthy family, a man unmoored from reality. He was convinced that a single violent act, 6 pulls of a trigger, could win the heart of actress Jodie Foster, a woman he'd never met but had developed a deep pathological obsession over after watching the film Taxi Driver countless times. His violent, desperate gesture for attention would fail to win him a movie star, but it would succeed in bringing a superpower to its knees. The first round from Hinckley's cheap Room RG 14.22 caliber revolver zipped past Reagan's head with a sound so thin it was almost lost in the noise of the crowd. Instead of finding its intended target, the devastator bullet, a projectile specifically designed to fragment and explode on impact, found White House Press Secretary Jim Brady. It struck him just above the left eye with brutal force, shattering his skull and entering his brain. He collapsed instantly, a human marionette whose strings had been viciously cut. Brady folded to the ground like a lawn chair someone had forgotten to lock into place. For a split second, a moment of impossible slowness, the scene froze in a tableau of disbelief. Cameras kept rolling out of sheer mechanical function. Reporters blinked, but nobody fully processed the sound. It was too out of place, too sharp and nasty for a weekday afternoon. But one man moved before the echo had a chance to die. Jerry Parr, the special agent in charge of Reagan's detail, didn't think. He didn't analyze. He acted. Years of training, raw instinct, maybe even a chilling premonition. Take your pick. The man was already airborne, launching his body forward like a missile to become a human shield for his protectee. 3 more shots, fired in a frantic, panicked succession, a sound like a camera shutter having a seizure. The chaos intensified. The second bullet caught D.C. police officer Tom Delahanty just as he turned to identify the source of the first shot. It struck him in the back of the neck, ricocheted violently off his spine, and sent him spinning to the pavement in a daze of shock and pain. Then came the defining act of courage. Tim McCarthy, a Secret Service agent built like a high school linebacker, hadn't even been scheduled to work that day. He was on duty only because he'd lost a coin toss for the assignment. Seeing the gunman aiming directly at the now exposed president, McCarthy made a conscious, life-altering decision. He planted his feet wide, squared his shoulders to the threat, and deliberately made himself as large a target as possible. He intercepted the fourth bullet, the one meant for the president's heart. It slammed into his chest with the force of a sledgehammer, tearing through his lung, liver, and diaphragm. As McCarthy fell, the fifth slug screamed past everyone, a metallic whine in the air. It ricocheted off the limo's inch-thick armored door, flattening on impact into the shape of a dime. And then, with all its velocity spent but its edges now razor-sharp, it knifed into Reagan's left side, just under his armpit. He winced, a sharp, searing pain he couldn't identify. He coughed, figuring Parr's desperate flying shove had cracked one of his ribs. He had no idea a bullet had just parked itself less than a single inch from his heart. The sixth and final shot was already on its way, zinging harmlessly across the street and shattering a storefront window as Special Agent Dennis McCarthy, no relation to Tim, dove from across the street and tackled Hinckley. He hit the shooter with such force that the kid's glasses skittered across the asphalt. Immediately, a swarm of other agents and local police piled on, a chaotic scrum of drawn guns and raw, overlapping shouts of, "Get down!" and "Gun!" The air, once crisp and cool, now tasted metallic, like burnt fireworks and pure panic. Reagan, having been pushed halfway into the limo by Parr's momentum, felt a strange, hot wetness spreading across his torso. He looked down and saw bright, frothy red blooming on his crisp white shirt, a crimson flower of death. "Jerry," he muttered, his voice tight with a pain far worse than any broken rib. "I think you broke my rib." Parr saw the blood, a sight that every agent is trained for but prays they will never see. His mind flashed, processing the color and texture in an instant. This wasn't the dark, venous blood of a minor wound. This was bright red, oxygenated, frothy. This wasn't a broken rib. This was a direct-to-the-lung gunshot wound. He slammed the heavy armored door shut, sealing them inside, and gave the only order that mattered. "George Washington, now!" 60 critical seconds on 14th Street. Inside the speeding, sealed capsule of the limousine, Reagan's knees buckled. The pain was now immense, a fire spreading through his chest, and he began coughing up blood. Parr, acting on pure, unadulterated instinct, grabbed a towel and jammed it against the wound, trying to apply pressure. Meanwhile, the driver, Agent Ray Shattuck, followed protocol, radioing a half-truth back to headquarters. "Rawhide is okay. We're returning to the White House." The White House, codenamed Crown, was the standard protocol destination in an emergency. It was a secure fortress with a medical staff on standby, but it was 12 minutes away through unpredictable D.C. traffic. The nearest Level 1 trauma center, George Washington University Hospital, was only 4 minutes away. Parr, kneeling over the bleeding president, did the math in a heartbeat. Protocol be damned. He knew the frothy, oxygenated blood meant a punctured lung, and that every passing second the president was losing blood he couldn't afford to lose. He yelled at the driver, overriding the initial plan with a command that could have ended his career if he'd been wrong. "Turn around. Get to GW Hospital. Go." That choice, that defiant and brilliant detour, shaved 8 critical minutes off the clock. 8 minutes that felt like an eternity. Surgeons would later say, without a shred of hesitation, that Jerry Parr's decision in that moment, and that moment alone, saved Ronald Reagan's life. The presidential limousine fishtailed into the ambulance bay at 2:35 p.m., its tires screeching. True to form, Reagan, ever the performer, insisted on walking into the hospital himself. He was the President of the United States, and he would not be carried in. He made it about 10 determined steps before the massive blood loss finally caught up with him, and gravity won. His legs gave out. A gurney rolled in to meet him just as he collapsed. In the controlled chaos of Trauma Bay 4, nurses and doctors, now realizing the identity of their patient, shredded his $800 custom-made suit with shears. Dr. Ben Aaron, the head of thoracic surgery, slid a chest tube into the wound to drain the blood and watched in mounting alarm as bright red arterial blood began to pour out at a terrifying rate. Reagan was hemorrhaging internally and was in grave danger. Yet, when his wife Nancy arrived, frantic with worry and her face a mask of terror, he looked at her through the oxygen mask and cracked a joke he famously borrowed from boxer Jack Dempsey after his brutal loss to Gene Tunney. "Honey, I forgot to duck." A few minutes later, as they slid consent forms in front of him for the emergency surgery, he scanned the room of anxious-faced doctors and added, "Please tell me you're all Republicans." The unbearable tension in the room instantly broke, replaced by a wave of relieved, incredulous laughter. It was the first sign the man, if not the president, might just pull through. Word of the shooting hit the White House Situation Room like a physical blow, long before the press knew what to call the story. The initial reports were confused, contradictory, and utterly terrifying. There was chaos. With the president's actual condition unknown and Vice President George H.W. Bush on a plane over Texas, a dangerous and unprecedented power vacuum emerged. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, a four-star general whose instincts were forged in rigid military command structures, sprinted to the press briefing room podium. Visibly shaken, sweating, and desperate to project calm, he did the opposite. He blurted out the 5 words that would haunt his career forever. "I'm in control here." Constitutionally, he was dead wrong. He was fourth in the line of succession, after the vice president and the heads of the House and Senate. And his statement, meant to project stability, only sowed more confusion and panic. Around him, aides frantically banged out contingency statements, half expecting to have to invoke the 25th Amendment for a transfer of power. Across the globe, America's allies refreshed telex machines, desperate for any solid information. In Moscow, the Soviets, fearing a coup, a decapitation strike, or a rogue general taking control, quietly raised their military alert level, unsure if Washington still had a steady finger on the nuclear button. While the world watched the president, 3 other men were fighting their own desperate parallel battles for survival in the same hospital. Jim Brady's head injury was catastrophic, the kind few people survive. Surgeons at George Washington University Hospital performed a grueling hours-long operation, removing a significant portion of his skull to relieve the immense pressure on his swelling brain. His prognosis was grim. At one point, a major television network erroneously reported he had died. Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy was more fortunate, if one could call it that. The bullet that had torn through his body had shredded parts of his liver and lung, but miraculously, it had missed his spine and major arteries by millimeters. D.C. officer Tom Delahanty, whose sick dog had caused him to swap shifts and take the assignment at the Hilton that day, had been shot in the neck. The bullet had nicked his carotid artery and damaged nerves in his spine. He would eventually lose the full use of his left arm. Every strained heartbeat in that hospital, every beep of a monitor in the ICU, became another subplot in a national drama playing out in real time. In 1981, news didn't travel at the speed of light, but at the speed of television. CBS broke into the soap opera As the World Turns at 3:24 p.m. Walter Cronkite's steady, trusted baritone informed a stunned America that the president had been shot. In that singular moment, the nation stopped. Commercials vanished from the airwaves. In classrooms across the country, teachers solemnly rolled in boxy television sets on tall, wobbly metal carts. In bars and hotel lobbies, strangers huddled together around grainy, endlessly repeating loops of the shooting, watching the chaos unfold again and again. Workplaces fell silent as radios were turned up and work was forgotten. By dusk, St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York was overflowing with people holding candles and whispering prayers for a man many of them had not voted for. Across the bottom of the screens of the fledgling 24-hour news networks, a simple, stark message scrolled: "Pray for President Reagan." It was a rare national moment of shared shock, a profound sense of vulnerability that bound the country together in a collective vigil. The surgeons cracked the president's chest open. Inside, they found the devastation. The ricochet had sent the flattened, sharpened bullet tumbling end over end, where it had sliced a brutal 3-inch path clean through his left lung. They found the projectile itself, a flattened, dime-thin slug of lead and aluminum, resting precariously against the pericardium, the delicate sac surrounding the heart muscle. It was close enough to have bruised the heart itself, but by some miracle had not penetrated it. The surgical team worked feverishly, patching the torn lung, suctioning out over 2 liters of blood, and finally closing the massive incision with 36 stainless steel staples. By 6:24 p.m., they stepped back, their mission accomplished. Reagan had lost nearly half his total blood volume, yet somehow, he had remained conscious enough through the initial ordeal to joke with the doctors before the anesthesia took hold. "What did the guy shoot me with, an ice pick?" Reagan spent the next 12 days in the hospital, turning his recovery into a masterclass in public reassurance. From his bed, he held staff meetings, signed legislation into law, and ceaselessly charmed his nurses. He insisted on watching an episode of Saturday Night Live and laughed so hard at a sketch making light of the shooting that he popped a stitch, causing a brief panic. Nancy, ever watchful and fiercely protective, fussed with his pillows and monitored his every visitor. At one point, he looked at his assembled senior staff and, with a twinkle in his eye, quoted General George S. Patton. "30 years from now, when you're sitting by the fire with your grandson on your knee, you'll be able to say, 'I served with Ronald Reagan.'" The nurses, hearing this piece of presidential bravado from the recovering patient, had to take a moment outside his room to compose themselves. His humor was more than a personality quirk. It was a powerful political tool, signaling to the country and the world that he was not just surviving, but was every bit still in command. The world, which had held its collective breath for hours, finally exhaled in relief. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, Reagan's staunchest ideological ally, called the shooting ghastly in a message of support. Pope John Paul II, who would himself survive a would-be assassin's bullet just 6 weeks later in St. Peter's Square, sent a personal note: "God spared you for a purpose." Japan's Prime Minister told reporters, "America's heartbeat is strong." But perhaps the most telling reaction came not from a diplomat, but from Wall Street. When the markets reopened the next morning, they didn't crash as they had after previous national traumas. Instead, they rallied, climbing an astonishing 14 points. It was the first post-assassination attempt rally in U.S. history, a powerful and tangible vote of confidence that the foundations of American power were secure and that leadership was stable. The legal aftermath. John Hinckley Jr. was indicted on 13 federal and local counts, including the attempted assassination of a U.S. president. The subsequent trial in 1982 became a national spectacle, dominating the news. The defense unveiled his bizarre shrine to Jodie Foster and read from diaries filled with disjointed, delusional ramblings about the movie Taxi Driver and his mission. His lawyers argued that he was not evil, but profoundly and dangerously ill, suffering from a narcissistic personality disorder that had completely blurred the lines between reality and his own twisted fantasy. On June 21, 1982, after days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that sent shockwaves across the country: not guilty by reason of insanity. Public outrage was immediate, immense, and bipartisan. Hinckley was committed to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a psychiatric facility in Washington, D.C., which would be his home for the next 3.5 decades. The verdict sparked a nationwide overhaul of criminal statutes, forcing a significant tightening of the federal insanity defense and making it far more difficult to successfully use in court. The unsung heroes. The heroes of that day carried the weight of those 6 seconds of chaos with them for the rest of their lives. Jerry Parr, the agent who made the life-saving call to divert the limo, retired from the Secret Service in 1985 and became an ordained minister, often quoting Psalm 91, the Protector's Psalm, as if he had written it himself in that speeding car. Tim McCarthy, the agent who took a bullet for the president, recovered fully and served another 3 decades in law enforcement, eventually becoming a respected police chief in Illinois, a living embodiment of the Secret Service ethos. Tom Delahanty, the D.C. cop who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, left the force on disability but never missed a memorial for fallen officers. And Jim Brady, who suffered the most grievous wounds, turned his personal tragedy into a powerful public crusade. Alongside his formidable wife, Sarah, he became one of the nation's most formidable advocates for gun control, leading to the passage of the landmark Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act in 1993, which mandated federal background checks for firearm purchases. Their courage didn't end when the shooting stopped. It redrew laws, transformed Secret Service protocols, and shaped countless futures. The ripple effects from that day permanently altered the landscape of presidential protection. The Secret Service doubled down on protective research and intelligence gathering. The use of magnetometers to screen crowds became ubiquitous. Ballistic glass on podiums and armored lecterns became standard issue. Motorcade routes became shorter, more secure, and more randomized. From that day forward, hospitals along any potential route were pre-screened and vetted for their trauma capabilities. But the biggest legacy may have been political. Reagan walked out of the hospital with a newfound aura of invincibility, a man who had faced death and joked about it. 6 weeks later, he strolled into a joint session of Congress to a thunderous bipartisan hero's welcome and leveraged that immense political capital to pass the biggest tax cut package in American history. Historians still argue whether surviving the bullet gave Reagan the personal steel and public clout to stare down the Soviets and, ultimately, help bring the Cold War to a close. More than 4 decades on, those 6 pops at the Washington Hilton still echo. They echo in Secret Service training manuals, in constitutional law textbooks, in university classrooms, and in late-night documentaries. They serve as a chilling reminder that the grand, sweeping arc of history can pivot in the time it takes to sneeze. But more importantly, they remind us that history isn't just shaped by presidents and generals, but is often steered by the split-second choices of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. By Jerry Parr yanking the limousine wheel, by Tim McCarthy planting his feet to take the hit, by nurses methodically squeezing blood bags, and by strangers lighting candles together in a darkened church. The chaos was born of one man's delusion and lasted a mere 6 seconds. The courage it inspired? That's permanent. If you're hungry for more stories of presidential near misses, hit that subscribe button. Next week, we'll talk about the time Teddy Roosevelt was shot in the chest and refused to stop giving his speech.